So, Robert, first off, congratulations for your experience, recognizing that it wasn't an experience that uh, fell upon you, but rather it was something that you created and that you know that you can create that. You did it once, you can do it again. And that you had mentioned that the key ingredient for that was changing your thought from unwholesome thoughts to wholesome thoughts. This is a major point, and that the Buddha talks about it in dozens of suttas.
Mm.
Mostly, he's talking about it, he's mentioning it from the perspective of the hindrances to be removed. And a lot of people get that, but they don't understand the immediacy or the need or the necessity of it. And yet, in a few suttas, it really is the the important point. One is, in fact, Sutta number 19, which is the name of the sutta is Two Kinds of Thought. Immediately, you get the idea of what he's talking about there. There are two ways of thinking: wholesome thoughts and unwholesome thoughts, and we're in the habit of having unwholesome thoughts generally because our society requires it of us. Now, when we're talking about unwholesome thoughts in this regard, we can talk about it in the sense of a term that is familiar and well loved in West in the English language, and then that is the word to be critical. That in fact we even hire critics to write articles in newspapers when they had newspapers. I guess now every blog is a critic.
Sure.
All right. So, in the Buddhist dispensation, critical thinking is unwholesome
Mm.
because it generally has ill will. I like that. I don't like that. This was good. That was bad. I give it a score. All of that is the critical thinking. And you can see um, the second noble truth at work there:
Mm.
greed and ill will. I want this. I like this. I don't like that. This is good. This is bad. And that wholesome thoughts are non critical, but rather nurturing and accepting. And that I don't spend much time on Reddit, but when I do, I find a lot of critical thought in all of the Buddhist places that are visited.
Sure.
And so,
Typical internet,
yeah,
kind of internet board chatter. Yeah.
right. How is it that that this whole point is missed? That we should be on the internet on Reddit, congratulating each other for our insights, congratulating each other for our newfound wisdom, congratulating each other for developing a practice.
What's funny about that is if you look at my Reddit account, a lot of the comments are just what you described. Someone posted a picture of their dog. All right, cute dog, that's great, or something along those lines, whatever the post happens to be. That's how I do Reddit, but I'm in the minority by far.
Uh-huh. Funny thing
Yeah.
about that, I have been on a couple of dog sites and animal sites, and that's the only place where I see wholesome comments.
Yeah, yeah. No, I just used the dog example because it came to mind, but I mean, I might also do it for something more serious. Someone writes about losing a parent or something, and I might write, "I'm sorry to hear that," good luck with everything, something along those lines. Because there's a lot of more serious Reddits too. But generally speaking, I try to be wholesome on social media, and social media often does not nurture that kind of attitude at all. It does not give incentives to act in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Those types of comments usually do not rise to the top, but the person that made the post might appreciate it nonetheless, which is what's important. So,
That's the important. That's the important thing. Well, you can also see that media, for instance, all of the news, cable news, TV news, news that is was cable and is now internet, is always critical thinking.
yep.
Their job is critical thinking. If they had wholesome stuff on it, nobody would listen. Nobody wants wholesome for some reason in our society. They're always looking for at least give me some good news about my team and bad news about their team.
Yep, yep, very true. The media makes money off of the unwholesome,
Hmm.
is the truth of it, and they make a lot more off that than they do off of positive material and content.
Uh-huh. They even have a line that says it all, and that is what bleeds leads.
Exactly. Yep. Yep. It's there's a book by the journalist Matt Taibbi. He it's reporting on how the media industry works. The name of the book says it all, which is Hate Inc.
Right. And so, uh,
Yep.
when students begin to realize that that is the ocean that we are born in, swim in, live in our whole lives, and die in, that world of criticism, that world of critical thinking, that the Buddha would call unwholesome thought. When we recognize that and we begin to practice wholesome thought, you can find that you can get yourself into very nice states. That the
Totally.
first jhana is absolutely available, but the important point is we have to remove those critical hindering thoughts. Have to be gone. That's the
Yep.
first thing that has to be done. So,
Oh,
uh,
I have a comment or question. If you
mhm,
wouldn't mind, if you'd like to continue, feel free. But
go ahead.
okay, sure. So a couple of comments. So um, one is that given the times we live in right now, where people are isolated, socially distanced, etc., I think many people, myself included, have been spending a lot more time in the media world or with their devices, than they would have before the pandemic.
Mm,
So I think that's created a lot of negativity in our society. People just on their phones all day, and it was bad before, but I think it's gotten maybe 20% worse, 30% worse, and it was already quite bad before this. But
mhm,
so that's one comment. But a question. Um, so when I did my former practice, which was kind of a Ramana Maharshi more style of just focusing on I am, and there was no instruction with respect to how to address the content of one's thoughts. It was just kind of focus on I am, which was quite a pleasant practice, but it would often take me 45 minutes to actually get to the pleasant part of the practice, you know,
mhm,
and thoughts would be coming in and out, and I would just kind of, I wouldn't be upset that there were thoughts. I would just accept that they were there, focus on the I am, and it would be kind of like, if you have like a big bowl of water and you had just been shaking it for a long time, and the water continues to shake
mhm,
naturally, and the thoughts would continue like that, and they would get slower and slower and slower until maybe the 45-minute mark where it comes to a still. But what was interesting with this method is it would just go right to it. It was just like, okay, you know, and that was very nice because I'm so used to having to wait for the meditation to actually start to take effect.
right. Exactly. Congratulations again. You're
Thank you.
getting it. That's the whole point. Some students will practice correctly, and some will continue to do. They call and they listen, and then they go do what they were already doing.
Sure. Well, thank you for the instruction because it really helped. So,
Well, it's not
yeah.
mine. I didn't invent it. that in fact, it took a long time for me to actually figure it out, even when I had excellent teachers telling me.
Hmm.
I was one of the slow ones too. And
So,
so,
yeah.
go ahead.
Okay, so a few things. So one is, I have a meditation app, and the only reason I use it is for the timer and because it tracks all my meditation history, which is just kind of nice to look at sometimes. But this was my first meditation, I think, in about a week or so. And what was interesting about that is over the prior week, I had been speaking with you, and we had been discussing many different things, whether it was movies or whatever, whatever. And when I sat down to finally sit, a lot of your lessons I had kind of incorporated into the meditation, and so it was much more effective, which was really interesting to see that process unfold. It's like partly I didn't even realize I was getting meditation instructions to some extent. You know, uh, it felt like we were talking about the Dharma, which is great, but there would be some meditation instruction kind of behind that I was fortunately able to see, which was nice.
Actually, that's a topic of conversation that I've had with Achan Po.
Hmm.
To always advertise that this is Dhamma, that we don't teach meditation,
Sure.
we teach the
Interesting.
Dhamma, and
Interesting.
that the Dhamma is hinged upon dukkha, dukkha nirodha, which immediately can be translated after you, because we've talked about it already, immediately translated into unwholesome thoughts, wholesome thoughts.
Sure.
Hmm. And that's about all there is to it, is to monitor and make sure that the all thoughts that we have are wholesome. Now, one thing about that 45-minute mark that you were talking about, that's well known. That is very, very well known. And so this is part of the reason why students have wanted to build up amount of time, is that they
Yeah.
want to sit with an agitated mind long enough for it to settle down so that they can get something out of the meditation.
Right. Which
And
also, yeah.
while at the same time they're sitting there agitating their mind with unwholesome thoughts.
Yeah, and it makes you not want to meditate because you
That's one
get
of the
45
unwholesome
minutes
thoughts.
of meditation and then 15 minutes of bliss. It's like, well, the bliss was nice, but I had to, swim through shit to get there. And it's like, do I want to spend my day doing that or going to the gym or something? You know
Mhm.
what I mean? And
Exactly. Well,
yeah,
it's even worse. It's even worse in the sense of this, and that is that generally when people are wading through that pile of shit, they're not actually practicing correctly at all. For instance, they're not breathing well, they're not removing unwholesome thoughts, and because they're not breathing well, and they're sitting there trying to do something repetitive, guess what? The mind will get tired. We already know all about in Western psychology and Western education the concept of um, attention span. And that one of the qualities that we have noted over time, in fact, it's quite obvious that uh, attention span will then, for an entire audience and a speaker, if that, like at church, if a normally sermons in the Baptist church last for 20 minutes, they know that. But if the sermons would go 20 minutes for a while, and then 25 minutes for a while, and then 30 minutes for a while, over the course of a year, they could build up to a 45 minute, and then the people would then start to feel the bliss that they came to church to feel.
sure.
Isn't that amazing? And that happens also. because of our attention span, that basically at that 45-minute mark or sometime in that area is when the ordinary mind gets tired.
Hmm.
And one of the things that it gets tired doing, it gets tired with all the critical stirring and all the swimming in the shit.
Yep. Yep. It
And
just
because
gets enough. Yeah.
and enough. And so we just kind of relax in that sea of shit. And because of it, it's no longer shit. It just, and just we kind of fall into that kind of state. Okay.
Sure.
This is what people will call deep meditation.
Sure.
Right.
But it's not unnecessarily deep. It's like,
Unnecessarily deep.
yep.
And not only that, but look at all the digging we had to do and all the shit we had to swim through to get there. When in fact, the whole point of the teachings of the Buddha is to get rid of the shit immediately. Come out of the
Right. And
unwholesome.
right. In my experience today, there's the comment that you've made, I think, in several podcasts or conversations or whatnot, which is that it's good in the beginning, good in the middle, good in the end.
Mm-hmm.
And when you said that, it sounded like a little bit like either a koan of some sort or fake advertising,
Uh-huh.
where where it's like, maybe it is kind of good, but it's not really that good, in the beginning, which has been my experience with meditation, is that it's sometimes it's okay, but it's generally not very good at the beginning, and it's not really till the end that it's good. But today, it was good at the beginning, it was good in the middle, it was good in the end, and that was great, like I understood what you were talking about, you
Mm-hmm.
know. Yeah.
Uh, Actually, I just ran across that one phrase yet again in a sutta I was reading last night.
Hmm.
So that one phrase, good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, is just populated many times. That would actually be a good research project from some enterprising one who is really into the suttas, is to start recording when he run across that one particular phrase. Or we could do that with a whole bunch of topics,
Hmm.
because even though um, the Tripitaka is a whole bookshelf or a bookcase full of books, the Dhamma is actually quite small. And that much of what the Tripitaka is about the stories that back up the teachings.
Hmm.
So there'll be a whole story about, let's say, Katasi Gautama, where she's carrying a dead baby, trying to get some magical person to help her to cure it. She eventually gets to the Buddha and he says, okay, I need 10 anise seeds or mustard seeds from 10 different
I know that
households
one.
that
Yep.
have never had. Okay, so, but the Dhamma in there is very small, but this long story about her eventually putting down that baby
Hmm.
is the essence of the suttas. But we can bring stories into the present day. Like people, they don't know about a woman 2,500 years ago carrying a dead baby around. That just sounds so ridiculous. Nobody would do that nowadays. And yet
Right.
people will sit and watch Fox News doing exactly the same thing that they're trying to teach them in the Kasigatami Sutta. This is to drop those dead babies,
Sure. Sure.
shut them down. Okay. For example, Trump is out of office. He's a dead baby now. Set him down.
Yeah. So so I have another question. So one thing I've noticed is, when I first began the meditative aspect of this practice, and what I mean by that is the meditation outside of the meditation.
Hmm.
Like outside of the sitting practice, going through my day.
This is when it
Um,
becomes a Dhamma practice. It's not meditation at all.
right. And
Meditation is
my
when you sit down in seclusion. But when you
sure.
get up
And
out of the seclusion, now you're in Dhamma. We live in a sea of Dhamma.
sure. And so my question was, um, I've noticed there's a difference between sometimes I'll have the tendency to, instead of saying grabbing the restlessness, saying, "Oh, there you are again. There's the restlessness, where I will be lazy mentally and just be like restlessness, and then be like, okay, everything's great, you know." And I noticed there's actually a difference, between doing that. And if I actually seize the restlessness, and I'm like, oh, there it is again, got it, and then return to a wholesome thought, of, this is fine right now, that seems to have a better effect than just labeling it for what it is, the restlessness alone,
Mm.
with no emotion, and then going to this is fine. That seems to me to be not as vivifying, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that because,
You're
yeah.
actually now leading into the topic that we started into before we turned the video recorder on, and that is back to Mahasi. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So back to Mahasi. I ran across it on the internet, an old book that he had written that was eventually translated into English in 1965. I don't remember the name of it, but the important point was is that it followed along in a format of Sutta number 24, which is the chariot race. And it also, because it does, follows the same format as the Visuddhimagga because the entire Visuddhimagga is laid out that way. And so, just as kind of a side note, let's talk about that sutta and what's in it because it actually has the entire path laid out as to
Mhm.
exactly how practice is to be done. Now, the important thing is that this is a sutta that fits in directly, dovetails into Sutta number 48, also in the Majjhima Nikaya, because it also has 7 steps. But here, the 7 steps are to Sotapan, to where in the Sutta number 24, the chariot race, the 7 steps there are for the entire show, the entire mountain. And that you can also see that basically that this whole thing of the 7 in Sutra number 24, a certain little section of it is actually what is in Sutra number 48. And that's kind of mind blowing to recognize that this stuff is so well known that it was practiced. And guess what? It's practiced by human beings, and every one of them who is a human being is going to basically go through these same steps just because that's the way that it is. So, in Sutra number 24, which is the big expanded version of it, it starts with Sila, to where the Sutra number 48 doesn't. It starts with already a strongly established practice.
Hmm.
Okay, so from that perspective, uh, we can look at that 7 steps in the Sutra number 24, and later we'll talk about Sutra number 48. It can't really be done in one talk
Sure.
because it's got so many brilliant things in it. But in Sutra number 24, it's basically a conversation between a visiting monk who is a teacher someplace in the outer regions, and he
Oh,
comes to town.
quick question before we begin.
Uh-huh.
Is there a good resource you would recommend for reading these suttas or finding them?
I would say I would have to go to the fact that since Bhikkhu Bodhi's translations are so well known and now they're being leaked onto the internet, even though Wisdom Publications doesn't particularly like it. In fact, there is a PDF of the entire Majjhima Nikaya by Bhikkhu Bodhi. So because he's prolific, because he's common, and because also he started out with translations from Bhikkhu Nanamali, who had a talent of very flowery, beautiful language,
Hmm.
that I would recommend that one. I would recommend Bhikkhu Bodhi's, but the one that I use is Bhikkhu Subhanto on Sutra Central. The reason that I'm using that is not because it's a good translation at all, but because the website allows us to mix the Pali and the English, line by line, a line of English, line of Pali, a line of, or a verse of
Hmm.
English, or verse of Pali, like that. Um, and that's what is really interesting, and that's the way to go to answer that question is that if you really want to know what the Buddha said, you got to learn not only Pali, but you're going to have to also kind of almost reinvent the lexicon,
Hmm.
because many times the lexicons are wrong. And the reason that that's true is because the original translators had to do lexicons. They had to
Right.
do it because they didn't know the language at all. They had to create the lexicon in order to help them do the translations. And to now,
Right.
everyone who is learning to do translations will use those old lexicons. And those lexicons were done by a Christian, not a Dhamma dude.
Right.
It was done for research, okay? And
Dark
because,
night of the soul. Yep.
hmm uh, well, there's a lot of it in there.
Right.
There's that the teachings of the Buddha have been thoroughly Christianized.
Hmm.
Why would I say that? Well, look at all the words that we know of when we're describing Buddhism. We're using Christian words to do it: monk, nun, temple, meditation, uh, concentration, uh, those kind of words, prayer, chanting.
Sure, I believe you. I mean, it's funny. I don't know how familiar you are with Carl Jung, but he would compare Buddhism to Christianity to Buddhism, because of
Hmm.
course he was going off whatever the German translations were, because he was a German, and he would consider Buddhism to basically be kind of an Eastern version of Christianity, which couldn't be further from the truth in many respects. But he probably he was a very sophisticated thinker, so I'm sure he had his argument for that. But um, I think however his argument has been represented, it's been, they're very different. They're very
Okay.
different. Yep.
So anyway, that's the short answer to your question is start with Bhikkhu Bodhi and wind up in the Pali.
Well, I don't know. The poly would take me a really long time to ever get to, but it's a nice aspiration.
Hey,
Maybe
I'm
someday.
75 and still learning.
Yeah. uh, so,
And 15 years ago, I published a book on chanting
oh,
in
wow.
Pali.
Wow. I'm not aware of that. Quite cool.
So, back to that sutta number 24. It's actually a conversation between a monk who was a well known teaching monk in a far flung district and Sariputta. Now, this guy knew who Sariputta was because of reputation and whatnot, but Sariputta didn't know this guy. And so, after they met, Sariputta is going to give him a little test. Okay? So, this is actually a kind of a test between two old masters, one recognized and the other one unknown. And so, he's being tested. And this is actually true in the sense that uh, with nobles, it takes one to know one. It takes a noble to know a noble. Well, ordinary people may not recognize a noble as noble, but
Not,
but
not not to interrupt, but in rabbinical school, it's actually the same. You're not allowed to be a rabbi unless another rabbi says you're a rabbi.
oh,
Although it's a little different because a noble doesn't declare someone a noble per se, but you need
not
one
in
to know
public,
that one is.
not
Yeah,
in
yeah,
public, or if
right.
it's in public, it's done in code.
Sure. And with the rabbis, it's all private. I mean, not it's all public. I mean, it's all public, which is very different, but it's similar idea.
Hmm.
Which,
So
yeah.
so here is then a way of testing because
And
uh, go
one
ahead.
last point before we get to that. I think it's actually interesting to compare Judaism to Buddhism in some respects because Judaism doesn't try to convert anyone, and there's kind of this notion of nobles in a sense, although it's a very different notion.
Hmm.
the Jewish sense
Maybe
of
it's
that.
not so different. Maybe if you take a little bit of the magic thinking out of it, they begin to look
Yeah,
very close alike.
yeah, that would be interesting. That would be something to look into. But then I'm half Jewish, by the way, so that's my education there. But anyhow, please continue.
I
Sorry to
assume
interrupt you.
that it's on your father's side.
It is. Yep. Why?
Easy
What?
guess with a last name like Cohen.
Yeah. Yeah. There you go. Yeah. I was gonna say, wow, you must be able to read minds or something, you know?
It's called clairvoyance,
Yep.
seeing clearly, and clairvoyance is not necessarily magical.
Hmm.
It's observational.
Interesting.
Another word
Anyhow.
for clairvoyance is wisdom,
Hmm.
which means to look and to see, but not just to see what's happening, but to see the trajectory of things.
Hmm.
An example of that would be when you're on a gun range, everyone at that gun range is very, very interested in which direction every gun there is pointed.
Sure.
Okay? But in normal life, people don't look at where all of our mental guns are pointed. Because if we point at something, it may go off.
Sure.
Okay, so this is back to the whole idea then of wholesome and unwholesome thoughts. Holster your weapons. Don't wave them around.
Sure.
So back to this sutta now. Um, the first question actually sets the tone, and that a lot of people would answer this question yes, but this question was answered no by this guy, and that is basically about the point of sila,
Hmm.
the value or the what is sila important and valuable? Is it the path? And the answer to that is no.
And quick question, sila means defilement, correct?
See, well, actually, the word sila is as close to the translation backwards as sin
Hmm.
would be in the Christian uh, world. So one's sila is one's morality. We can use
Ah.
words like morality and virtue and all of these really old words. We don't really have any. Maybe the modern word would be ethics.
Hmm.
Okay. But all in all, together, um, it is physically, the individual physically restrains himself from acting upon his wrong thoughts.
Hmm.
That there you are waving your gun around, but don't pull the trigger.
Hmm.
Okay, so that's sila. That's the first step. And when I say first step, that was the first question, but we'll get into why it's the first step later. The second one, uh, gosh, I don't even remember. I remember the third. Oh yes, um, it goes like this. They also the word that makes many Westerners confused is that it kind of talks about the perfection of sila. So is in fact perfection of sila or purity. I think in fact the word is purity. Purity of sila is the question. And this
Hmm.
visiting monk says no. And then the second one is to clean out the mind, the purity of the mind, which now we're talking about removing unwholesome thoughts and putting in wholesome thoughts. But it doesn't say there. So it's talking about purity of mind. Um, and then the third step is knowledge and vision of what is and is not the path. Now, this is doubt, because when we know how to clean out the mind, we know how to behave ourselves with sila, we know how to clean out the mind, and we have knowledge and vision of what is and what is not the path. then that begins to put us at the stage of Sotapan.
Mm.
That's an important point. Because this is the full eradication of doubt. And as you've probably heard, there are three fetters in the beginning, and that is personality vu, attachments to rites, rules, and rituals, or sila bhatta paramasa, and doubt. So now here at step three in this chariot relay race, it is fixed at this point is that when one has knowledge and vision of what is and is not the path, has already been able to clean out his mind and has already got his sila up to scratch, we'll call it, rather than pure or perfect, but just up to scratch. When the sila is up to scratch, and when our purification of uh, the mind, which also, by the way, leads to purification of view.
Mm.
And that uh, purification of view is basically the coming to the point of no self. Because the
Mm.
views that we have is I'm important. I'm the star here of my show. And I'm also the victim of everybody else's show. Okay. And when we recognize, wait a minute, we're just all in this together. This is not my
Right.
private sewer. I'm in everybody's sewer. This is a city sewer we're in. And so with that um, comes that purification of the eradication of doubt. And what that means is that we now have all the tools to live because we've got the path, we've got the mind straightened out, we've got our behavior going. And that I won't go through
um,
the sequence of events, but rather to go ahead and finish up with this sutta. But first, let's go ahead and ask your question.
sure. So historically, for myself, one thing I've noticed is I've often felt in life like I've known what to do and I've known what the right path of action is, but I have not been able to execute on that path of action. So, for example, take exercise, which I know you ridiculed a bit yesterday, but I generally speaking feel healthier and happier when I exercise, right? It's something I've noticed has produced positive states for me. Um, and there's science about it, etc. And I will think to myself, I know to exercise, I know to eat healthy, I know to meditate, to do these healthy things. And then sometimes I just, recently, oftentimes, due to my job being intense lately, I just won't do it. And so I'll know to do it. I might know, oh, I should write my friend from last week. I should have written him back. I know to do it, and then I just don't do it. Or you could say, like, let's say you're an addict of some kind, like you're a gambling addict, and or in my case, maybe social media addict. You spend too much time on the internet, right? Um, you know, not it's not good for you, yet you still do it. um,
Out of
so
habit, right?
out of habit, yes.
And the reason for that is that that's eventually what we're going to get down to is what Mahasi was saying, which is to seize it. That
Mm,
the addict, let us say the gambler, does seize it when he runs out of money. When he recognizes how much dukkha it is, he eventually will quit. Some don't. Some will go into great debt.
right.
They have not figured it out. But many people can go to Las Vegas their first trip, see the gaudiness, piddle with some gambling, recognize what a sham it really all is, and can walk away and go home because they can see that dukkha. They've actually recognized it. For someone who is already hooked on it, he has to actually grab hold of that.
Mm,
Okay. But always this grabbing hold that we're talking about is in this very moment.
Right.
So you can't grab hold of going to the gym tomorrow.
Right.
You can only grab hold of going to the gym, getting up out of the chair. You can only grab going out the door and going to the gym. And so once you have that, then when you get into the gym, now you still have to grab that dumbbell, both with your
So,
hand and your mind.
so a couple of comments on that. One is I think you're totally right, and say for example, let's say like for me, I spend too much time on my phone, right? And I might think while I'm on my phone, I'm spending too much time on my phone. But then I won't do anything and I'll continue to spend time on my phone.
That's
But if
because
I
you haven't
actually
grabbed it
see
yet.
that,
You've just
yes,
noted it or you've just witnessed it, but you
right,
haven't grabbed it.
right,
To
right,
actually
and
grab it means to you will turn the phone off and set it down.
right. And my second comment was, if you get into this, so I wonder if seizing and grabbing is also a habit and a muscle that can be developed, or if it is something that you get tired of doing, and that's kind of one of my questions is,
The
like if I
answer to
seize
that
and grab all the
obviously is
time,
both. It's
yeah,
clearly both.
hmm,
You
because
will you will get
yeah,
tired of it the first time that you check it out because we as Westerners especially are overly zealous. It's almost like the first time that someone goes to the gym, they almost always overdo it.
yep,
But if he keeps going back to the gym, then he'll develop the muscle so that by the time he's in the gym the eighth or ninth time, he can easily do what the first day was a big struggle.
right,
Okay? So that's easy enough to understand. But let's go through this and finish the story and then get into the Mahasi because you kind of got a little bit ahead here.
sure,
Basically, what the name of the sutta, the chariot relay, actually answers the question in a very profound way because the answer to each one of these questions of not is knowledge and vision of what is and what is not the path. Is that the purity that's the big one, or this
hmm,
is it? And always the answer is no. And so Sariputta then questions him, please explain. And he says that it's very much like a chariot race or a chariot relay, that the king will get into his chariot from Saranath going to Rajgiri, and he will go to a way station and rest and change horses. And then he will get back into the chariot with a new team and perhaps new workers and grooms and whatnot, and go to the next way station. And then he will get new horses, new chariot, maybe, and now the king can go to the third relay. When he finally gets from the sixth relay to the destination, Rajgiri, by the time he gets there, no one can say that he got to Rajgiri by going to that first stage. But he can't also say he got to Rajgiri because he went from the last stage to Rajgiri,
sure,
right? That it in fact was this one plus this one plus this one plus this
sure,
one plus
sure,
this one plus this one. And that's what we often miss. That's the actual very, very profound point. Let me give you an example of that. Aunt Susie comes over to visit Mommy while Johnny is practicing the piano and he's getting ready for a piano recital. And so Mommy says, Aunt Susie, please listen to little Johnny play. And he plays that recital piece that he's been practicing perfectly. And everybody congratulates him. Wow, that's really great. I really like that piece of music. You did it beautifully. But everybody is missing out on the fact that that performance was just one of those relay chases. that they had to start off by getting a piano. Then he
Right.
had to practice. And everything was a step by step sequence of events that led up to just that last event. But that last event is not any more important than any of the other phases, because if you'd have left any one of them out, he would have never got to the end.
Sure. And it's like saying, the Sunday game is won during the training season, you know,
That's
like in
another,
football.
exactly right. That's the mentality is that we have to start paying attention to every step along the way.
Yep.
Okay. Now, excuse me. Mhm.
Bless you.
I don't have anything to drink here. Tam? Tam, are you here? Can I have a water?
Sorry, my pup just made a cameo appearance here. Um, anyhow, listening.
Thank you. So, getting back to the point about this book that Mahasi wrote, because we've just actually been talking about the sutta that this book is based upon, and that the point that Mahasi was making is that every object that we take in what Westerners would call meditation or in the practice of the Dhamma, every object that we have to take it by seizing it rather than just observing it. We have to seize that object, okay? And in the translation out of the Burmese into the English, they actually use the word fall on, the way that thieves would fall upon a victim. And also
Sure.
the translator used the word confront. Now, I wouldn't have used these words, but these are the words that are translated out of the Mahasi that point that Western practices of Mahasi don't do what Mahasi himself taught. That's very interesting. That somewhere
Hmm.
along the way, not only did the translation get a little bit missed, but in the practice, that perhaps the students who went to Burma didn't stay there long enough to get the full story about what has to happen. So when they come back, they're more psychologists than they are Dhamma teachers. And
Sure.
so this is part of the issue is that if the students understand this from the beginning, they can make progress very quickly. Is that each object that we take, we have to seize upon it, grab it, and confront it. Now, the most obvious place for that is the very first object that we take is the breath. And yet Western modern meditation practices says to watch the breath. But Bhikkhu
Right.
Buddhadasa and Mahasi, in fact, Bhikkhu Buddhadasa is actually quite eloquent about it. We have a video just recently of Alan talking about Anapanasati for the enthusiastic beginner. And that's where he actually reads to me out of Bhikkhu Buddhadasa's book about how important it is to grab hold, to seize, to take control of the breath as our
Hmm.
first object. If we can do that, in fact, the way of thinking of it is that if you can control your breath, to do so, you have to control the mind. And if you can control the mind and the breath, that will give you the tools that you will need to actually seize and control and take over the feelings.
So, and then that's why you ask just to make the breaths long, not to count them.
Hmm.
Because if you're counting them, that's a passive activity. and you only focus on the end of the breath, the end of the in and the end of the out, or the end of the whole cycle. Whereas if you're focusing on the length of the breath, that's an active requirement. That's an activity,
Hmm.
because you're in control of the breath while you're watching the breath.
Exactly so. Exactly. That's the part that's hard for people to understand, that we actually talking about intentionally long breath and on occasionally intentionally short breath. Now, when we're talking about a short breath, um, there's two ways to look at it, because both of them, actually, there's three ways to look at it. One is to look at the short breath as just letting it go back to normal and it will shorten up all by itself. Another one is to do, which is what Achan Dhammavitu, who still teaches at Wat Soen Mo. He's been a monk about 30 years and has been studying Bhikkhu Buddhadasa since he arrived. And he practices the short breath in the sense of taking in a lot of air in a hurry. But that short breath actually is hard. It's work. It is the kind of breathing that you would have like if you were doing a hill climb,
Sure.
running uphill, not just climbing a hill, but running, exerting, or running up the stairs of a 20-story building. And you know what kind of breathing you have when you're what they call out of breath.
Right. Or
And then,
hyperventilating.
no, hyperventilating is when you get way too much oxygen. This is a breathing that happens naturally because of the situation that the body is actually oxygen starved and is full of carbon dioxide. This is because we're getting tired. Two
Mm.
wrestlers start to huff and puff when they're wrestling with each other. All right,
Sure.
if they don't start taking those deep breaths, there's going to be some sort of chemical buildup in the muscles, and the muscles get painful and tired and weak. But if you keep breathing, then that will clean out all of those poisons that are coming from the exercise into the muscles, putting it in the blood and comes out the lungs. Except to do that requires new muscle work in the chest area. So I won't do it with you, but we'll actually do this sometime together for 3 to 5 minutes. But just for a few seconds, it would be the kind of breathing of
Uh,
your mouth gets dry, everything. Okay. Now that's actually painful, but if you do it while you're sitting, the whole body becomes vibrantly alive, tingly alive. You're getting really a lot of oxygen in there. This is
sure.
really good. Wakes up the mind. So in fact, this short breathing would be something when someone gets drowsy, to start taking breaths, to breathe a lot, to get the body oxygenated.
Have
Normally
you
when
heard
we're
of? Yeah.
normally when
Oh.
we're drowsy, it's because we're not breathing well anyway. So now we'll do the short breath to get things going, and then go
Sure.
back into the long breath. But in both cases, we're intentionally breathing, seizing that object, grabbing hold of it, confronting it.
Hmm.
You had a question?
Yeah. So have you heard of Wim Hof breaths?
No.
So Wim Hof is this guy that teaches a breathing technique similar to what you're discussing. It's like a, and it's freaking out my dog when I do that. It's funny. He's running around. But
High, right.
um,
It's where you
yeah,
hold your mouth, you're putting out high frequency noise.
right.
That's why the
And
dog is freaking out. Not because you're breathing, it's because when you do so, you whistle.
yeah, and it's interesting when you do the Wim Hof breaths. If you do it like a round of 30 or so, I think it's 30. You then can hold your breath for like a couple of minutes.
Hmm.
Much longer than normal.
Much,
And I
much
assume
longer
it's
than
the
normal.
same. Yeah,
The reason for it is because now you got the oxygen, which means
right.
that when the body gets starved from oxygen, that's when that mechanism in the anterior cortex will fire, and that is what kills people when they're drowning. is they're underwater and they can hold their breath. As long as they can hold their breath, they can stay alive. But when that automatic mechanism comes in, says, we've got to breathe, even if it's salt water, that's when we die. Is because of
Mm,
that. And guess what? It's a survival instinct. That survival instinct in that point will kill you.
sure.
So knowing that, we can understand why the Buddha actually could figure out that why breathing was so important. And yet, in our daily lives, we don't teach our kids in school about breathing at all. Even when they're in sports, we don't talk about the breathing. It's only the experts in sports who really begin to understand the importance of breathing.
Sure. There's a guy that came out with a book on breathing recently that's been quite popular. I should check it out. But he interviewed yogis and gymnasts and all these people about breathing. And I should really check that book out and report back to you on it, at some point.
Okay.
But yep.
All right. So let's go a little bit deeper into seizing that object because earlier you mentioned restlessness. All right. We can take restlessness itself as an object, but we have to actually not just look at it or note it or observe it or watch it. We have to seize it.
Right. And one comment briefly is I think restlessness, at least from my current viewpoint, is my worst hindrance, is worry and restlessness. It
Okay.
dominates the majority of my day, of all the hindrances. Anger is an issue, but it doesn't come up too much, maybe a couple times a day, or several times a day. But restlessness and worry is by far my number one. Maybe doubt might be number two, you know.
Okay.
Um, but I don't
Various
know.
cultures,
Probably, yeah.
various cultures have various specialties.
Yep.
Okay. And to be honest with you, the Jewish group are really experts at worry
Yep. Yep. Totally. And doubt.
and
Yeah.
doubt and
And
worry.
worry
But
and doubt can seem very similar. I don't really know what precisely the difference is, to be honest.
well, let's look at a little bit more modern tech terminology. We would call it stress and anxiety.
Sure.
And that one of the things that any Dhamma practitioner will do is begin to notice that feelings and emotion have both mental and bodily components.
Yep.
That not only when we're agitated do we feel agitated just in general mentally, but the body itself is agitated. And not only is the whole body itself agitated, but it's also, we can feel the agitation really, really strongly in certain parts of the body more than others. And that one of the places that we can feel that agitation, anxiety, is in the chest area, in the midsection of the body. Now, um, one of the reasons why that is there is because there is a chemical. It's called, actually, there's two of them. One is cortisol, and the other one is adrenaline.
Hmm.
And cortisol doesn't break down as fast. It kind of builds up, and so they've seen that over time, elderly people, part of aging is because they have high levels of cortisol in their blood.
Hmm.
But it comes both cortisol and adrenaline are chemicals that come out of the adrenal gland, and there's wiring, circuitry somehow between the glands in the back of the head, the pituitary and the pineal glands are connected directly to the adrenaline gland, so that our thoughts actually will start pumping just a little bit, or if we're really terrified, it'll just flood the whole system with adrenaline. And that adrenaline
Right.
in the blood then puts us into flight and fight mode. Well, guess what?
Right.
The meditator is sitting there, experiences anxiety, but there's nothing to flee from and there's nothing to fight. But the
Mm.
adrenaline is there anyway.
Right.
Okay, so what are we going to do with that? Because we have the feelings of, I got to go do something. Got to go,
Mm.
got to do. All right, and basically we can say that this stuff is a residual holdover from long term, but not necessarily vicious, unwholesome thoughts. Thoughts
Mm.
of danger, thoughts of I got to get this job done, thoughts of writing that email that we don't write, and all of that kind of stuff will bring up this anxiety. And so the first thing um, that we're doing in the practice of meditation is learning how to control the breathing. And also by changing the mind, one's right effort is to control and change the mind, but that leaves us then with something that we can do to actually seize these feelings because we can change them too. The Vedana is also possible to change. And so we can talk about the Vedana in two different worlds because they have two different chemical systems going on. One is the feeling system that's associated with fear, like fear, anger, sadness, um, longing, grief, those kind of feelings. And then there's the other kind of feelings that are not based upon fear. And that would be the feeling of satisfaction, the feeling of success, the feeling of security, the feeling of at ease. And so we actually want to seize our emotional system to begin to feel the way that we would want to feel, in the sense of the
Mm.
feeling of those feelings of well being. How do we do that? Well, one of the ways that we can do it is by when we recognize anxiety as anxiety, then we can begin to play with it as if it were a toy. One thing for sure about it is that when a child is playing with a toy, he has the ability to seize it, to fall upon
Mm.
it, to confront that toy. I've seen little girls really confront dolls to the point that there's a leg in one bedroom and a head in another. They tear the thing
Yeah.
apart. Exactly. That's how
And my
you want to,
puppy do that too.
yeah,
Yep.
you want to
Yep.
play with that anxiety. You want
Mm.
to tear it apart. You want to
Mhm.
inspect it completely. One way is that as you're breathing in, does it get bigger? And when you breathe out, does it get lower? In other words, can you make it pulsate? Can you actually change it enough to where you can get it to grow or to shrink? Can you identify exactly where it is? Or can you move around with it? Can you make it go to the upper chest? Can you make it go to the lower chest? Can you pedal with it? Can you play with it? Can you breathe out? Because if you can take control over it like that, guess what? We've changed our whole mind state from the mind state that got us into that anxiety into a completely new mind state, which is a mind state of being playful, being joyful.
Sure.
And so then now the feelings will turn into being playful, joyful feelings, and that anxiety will begin to melt away because number one, we're not pumping more adrenaline into the blood system.
Mm.
And number two, adrenaline breaks down fairly quickly. Cortisol, not so much. Cortisol will build up, but the adrenaline will break down very quickly. And if we're breathing out the the broken down amino acids that build up to make adrenaline can now be breathed out. And so we
Mm.
can literally breathe out that adrenaline
Mm.
when we seize it and
Oh,
take
yeah.
control of it. Out you go. And so now the
Sure.
emphasis comes on the out breath, is to be able to breathe that stuff out, to break it up, loosen it up, get it moving around, get the blood flowing, etc., like that, and then breathe it out. This is, um, let us say, a Western medical scientific way of talking about it. That maybe the Buddha didn't put those kind of things together, but he certainly put together that it worked.
Sure. And, it's interesting because, if you wouldn't mind for a moment, I'd like to discuss the physical feeling of worry, restlessness, and how that state feels physically.
Okay.
Um, and it's hard to explain, and I don't know if I can properly do it justice, but I will just attempt. So, um,
There's nobody
it
judging you. That's critical thinking. Did you see that critical thought that just went
it it
there?
is. It is. You're right. You're right. But I was also saying it with a smile on my face, so maybe it was, you
Not
know,
just exactly.
yeah, not the most critical. And it's interesting because I think it is possible to be thoughtful and in a way that might even come across as kind of critical, but to be kind of joyful about it too, at the same time. And um, when I was in my ceremonies and whatnot, they can be very expressive, and I would sometimes be critiqued a little bit um, for being too much in the mind. But for me, sometimes the mind is a space of play, and I think I think that's an important thing that's overlooked. I think sometimes we look at the mind and say, "Oh, you're thinking too much," but maybe it's actually just a way of playing, you know. So that's kind of
It
interesting.
is playing if
Yeah,
it's nurturing thought.
yeah,
It's not playing if it's critical thought. Now we're into, let us say, that they talk about it in schools nowadays that there's two kinds of games to play. The game where everybody has fun, and then the game that scores points and there's winners and losers.
right,
Okay. So nurturing thought is when we're not keeping score. We're just enjoying.
sure.
And critical thinking is when we're keeping track, keeping score. Well, I don't know if I can tell you exactly how it's going on or not. Okay, that's kind of a critical thought right there.
Sure.
Among some wholesome thoughts. So wholesome, critical, wholesome is a whole lot better than critical, wholesome, critical, you see.
Sure, and part of it too is just my trying to be honest, right?
Don't
And
stop.
like displaying some humility. Yeah. Because like oftentimes people will just spout off about X, Y, and Z, oh, I think this, I think that, whatever. And they don't know what they're talking about, you know.
Mhm.
And I think it's good to be a little careful, in your speech, and say, I don't really know what I'm talking about, but I'm trying. That can be, in my opinion, more confident and less critical than just putting it out
Okay.
there,
I'll,
sometimes. I don't know. Yeah,
I'll buy that.
I
I
don't know.
got no trouble with what you're saying.
Okay, cool. So,
So
so
it's now that we've gone around the corner, let's go back and talk about
go back
exactly what
to,
you do experience when you use
yeah,
the word
yeah,
anxiety.
sure. So when I experience this, it's kind of like there's like there is it's almost like there's like insects underneath my skin is kind of the feeling almost. Not actually, but it's like there's like a little bit of a shakiness there, you
Hmm.
know, and I experience kind of a shakiness, kind of a sense of disquiet as if I have to move. Like there's this feeling of I need to move in some way, which might be just moving my hands to take my phone out of my pocket and play on my phone, or read something on my phone. And then there's a little bit of a like uh, like an unsteadiness, where things are not quite like that smooth, clear sort of perception experience, and is more of a little bit of a, you know, moving from thing to thing sort of
Hmm.
experience, thinking about this, about that, reading this, reading that, you know, and it's kind of like a perpetual motion machine is activated, and it's one that I'm not happy about.
Okay.
I'm not necessarily disgusted by it or overly negative towards it, but it definitely does not make me happy, and it tires me out actually. And
Mhm.
you know, it's funny, and one more comment on this topic, and maybe more if they come. But like, let's say, you know, one time I noticed. So it was on a Saturday, and I was at my mom's house, and I had the house to myself, and I spent the entire day on Twitter. And by the end of the day, so I'd not moved anywhere. I didn't go anywhere. I didn't run any errands. I just spent the day on my phone. And by the end of the day, I was exhausted. And I had been on the couch the whole day, and I was tired instead of
Not just
refreshed.
reading, but tweeting.
Not tweeting even. I mean, maybe sending some messages and stuff like that. But, you know, like reading Twitter, which can be very inflammatory, you know, and then maybe
Right.
sending texts and that kind of thing, maybe some text messages, that sort of thing, you know. And I was exhausted, you know, and just that mental activity exhausted me,
Hmm.
you know, and I feel like I often feel like I'm more tired than I should be, you know, and I need more sleep than I should. And I think part of it is because I tire myself out with this kind of frenetic, you know, restlessness and worry, you know, which is kind of a shakiness in a sense. So,
Exactly.
anyhow, I hope that was helpful. And also, one last thing is I kind of feel it in my chest area too, you know, as well as my head, you know, and kind of my hands as well, you know, at times. So, and maybe sometimes my legs, like I might shake a leg, you know, or something like that. Um,
Well, okay. So now
yeah,
we're recognizing that it's got some points, but if we start to look, we can find that in fact it affects the whole body. Here's
yeah,
an example of that. Go into any waiting room. That waiting room can be at the bus station, it can be at the doctor's office, or many places, or you just see people standing in line in a queue, and you will see restlessness. People are not sitting still. They're not just sitting there in the waiting room. One person has got their legs crossed at their ankles, and one foot is just bobbing up and down. Somebody else has got their legs crossed, and that leg that's crossed bobbing up and down. People are
sure,
constantly in the state of motion, and that's what, um, let us say, keeps us in activity or keeps us sped up, doing things that bring on that anxiety, uh, because something needs to be done. So here you are sitting in the waiting room, and you can't do anything until the doctor comes out. Say if it's or the nurse comes out. But we're waiting because we're in anticipation, and so you can see how much agitation there is. Another place that's even more agitation is when people are waiting in line, like to buy the ticket to a theater or something like that. And people are enormously agitated when standing. And so this agitation, I've experienced it in a way. Um, it has a lot to do with motorcycles. I've had a lot of motorcycles in my life. And when I was in high school, I had a friend who he had a Triumph 650 Bonneville, and I had a Harley. And so we made sport out of frustrating the local police. They knew us. I've actually been in front of a judge because of this.
well,
And that judge, in fact, recruited me into the Naval Reserve
well,
when he found out that what we were doing. Because we could get the cops to chase us, but in those days, in those areas, we only had two-way roads, and they were in cars. And so we could zip through traffic easy. So we would zip up the road and then hide behind the gas station, and the cops would just zoom right
mm,
by,
well,
trying to
good for
catch
you
us.
guys. Yeah.
Well, I recognized eventually that that what was going on was that I was absolutely full of anxiety. That's what the racing of the motorbikes was all about.
Mm.
And that the last vestige of that anxiety or that restlessness I noticed here on this island in the past 10 years when I was driving the truck and that I had to go, let us say, to pick up a student at the port. That anxiety would come, and that if I didn't notice it, I was going to be driving that truck on that island the way that I drove the motorcycle in South Carolina in the 1960s.
Wow.
That I would be literally driven, but by taking a deep breath and say everything's going to be all right, and whoever's at the port will wait on me. They would rather see me alive and arrive late than to see me bloodied but early.
Sure. Depends on the person.
Well,
But no, but vast majority, yes. I'm just being a little funny, a little facetious, but yeah.
so anyway, yes,
Yeah.
that anxiety can drive our behavior if we're
Right.
not aware of it. So now that you're becoming aware of it, is probably is whether it's strong or not is not the issue. Whether you're paying attention to it or not is the issue. And people can go for years and not pay any attention to the fact that they're being driven around and being in a hurry trying to get something done when they could be relaxed
Right.
because they can remember to take a deep breath and to take control of that anxiety.
Right. And it's kind of a revelation for me, in a sense. Um, and I've often been very critical of myself, in the truest sense, for not doing what needs to be done, procrastinating, etc. And then kind of trying to get to the bottom of what the reason for that is, and you can tell yourself these stories, and the stories might be somewhat accurate, like you could say, well, I have a fear of failure, so I prefer not to take any action, or I have a part of my childhood, I was taught this, by my parents, or X, Y, and Z. You can come up with all these stories,
Mm-hmm.
and it's interesting because the Dharma approach, as taught by yourself, is just to notice the problem, the restlessness, not to worry about the whole storyline of how that restlessness came to incarnate, which we'll never really know, you know, we'll never really know the full story, and just say, hey, it's
It's a
there,
survival
and
mechanism.
let's get rid of it.
We know
Yeah,
exactly where it comes from. It comes from the survival mechanism. That 100,000 years ago, the world really was dangerous. It really was
sure.
dangerous. We lived in the jungle, and there was all
Yeah,
kinds of things to run away from. Now, in our modern society, there's nothing much to run away from, but we have all of those internal mechanisms that come out of our prehistory. All of that stuff comes right to us through the DNA. It
sure,
makes us
but
human.
Sure, but you can also, what a psychologist would say is, you're anxious about work, like doing the right job at work because maybe you displeased your father so much, with respect to your work ability that you have this sense of shame, so you don't do any work at all. That would be the psychoanalytic approach, right? Which might be true, that might be true. That might be correct.
I am really into developmental psychology. Studied it.
Yeah,
All of that kind of stuff. That's in fact possibly the best stuff that Freud did was
yeah,
the
yeah,
understanding of developmental psychology and what happens and how we traumatize ourselves as kids. Guess what? The Buddha
yes.
knew all about it. That's what the Pali word of Sankara is all about. Is all of
Hmm.
that memory and stored stuff that was stored when we were kids, stored in ignorance.
Right,
And,
but
and so we
yeah,
ignorantly responded to our dad and then got into the habit of that. So now that we're adults, we're ignorantly responding to the dad when in fact dad's not even there anymore. but we're still
Right.
ignorantly responding in the same way that we did. And so the whole practice of the Dhamma is to wake up to that stuff and seize it, take control over it.
So one thing I found interesting, in my journey of like plant medicines, for example, say if I'm in a plant medicine ceremony, um, is I will sometimes
Is that
leave.
what they call ayahuasca and peyote and all of that nowadays?
Yeah, 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 plant medicine ceremony. There you go. Anyway, for example, my very first ceremony, I had this feeling that there was a knot inside of me somewhere, and it had been undone. And I felt better, I felt lighter, and to this day, I feel that there was something that changed. But I cannot tell you what. I can't say, I released this memory from this trauma from when I was 6 years old, or something that happened at 12, or whatever. It was, or something from a previous lifetime. I can't tell you anything. All I can tell you is it's better. And sometimes I think like what's more important is that things are better than actually knowing the full story of how it got to be there, which seems to me to be part of the Dharma approach, is not necessarily knowing the full story, but just removing the hindrance. Like, would you say that's correct or not?
Absolutely. In fact, you're touching on what the Buddha referred to as the four imponderables,
Hmm.
the things which are not worthy pondering over.
Hmm.
And that if we do ponder over them, we're wasting our time because the pondering won't help. Pondering
Hmm.
is a kind of suffering, trying to figure things out that you cannot figure out. And that there are
Sure.
four of those things. And one of them is, how did things get started? We can, as Western physics enthusiasts or even Christian creationists, both of those groups are very curious about how things got started way, way long time ago,
Right.
right? And nobody knows. So all they can do is argue.
Right.
Because nobody knows how things got started. Well, guess what? We don't have to go so far back. We don't know how a lot of stuff got started, and it's not important. There it is in this present moment. Never mind what happened to it in the past to make it how it is right now. Here it is
Right.
right now and needs to be dealt with right now. And so that's one of the four imponderables is how did things get started? Another imponderable is the extent of the mind, the extent of the human mind. No one
Hmm.
knows that. For example, 10 years before Einstein, no one knew of the things that Einstein could think of, right? And so
Sure.
in the future, people are going to figure out things that we haven't figured out yet.
Sure.
We don't know the extent of the human mind, and we do not know the extent of the human mind as it's capable of so off into the future. Uh, Einstein talked about it in the sense of standing on the shoulders of giants. If it hadn't been for Newton, Einstein would have been out of business. Guess what? If it hadn't been for Galileo and some of the others, Newton would have been out of business. So we build like that. We build our technology, we build our human knowledge. And for that reason, we don't know the end of it. We don't know the extent of it. But generally, we don't even know the extent of what our friends are capable of, nor do they. That no one knows the extent of the capabilities of the human mind, which would be then like the people who do not know what jhana is will have a magical view or an idea of it, rather
Right.
than the actual experience of it. Once you have the experience of it, then you know what it is. Until then, you don't. People don't know
Right.
what the mind is capable of, and that's one of the four imponderables.
Right.
Another of the imponderables is that you do not know what happens to a Buddha, for instance, after he dies. You don't know that.
Hmm.
But if you take it into the logical consideration, you don't know what happens to anybody after they die. We don't know.
Sure.
We just don't know. We don't have any evidence, and so because of that, that's not worth thinking about. And yet, look how much religion is talking about after you die. We've got this vision and that idea, and nobody knows.
Right.
If nobody knows, that means that it is not scientifically testable, which means that it has no effect scientifically upon any scientific experiment, which means that it really has no effect anywhere. If something has absolute no effect anywhere, then it is absolutely irrelevant. It's
Sure.
irrelevant. Okay, so what happens in the beginning is irrelevant. What is the human mind is capable of? That's irrelevant. We don't know those things. What's
Right.
going to happen after you die is irrelevant.
There's a great Zen Buddhist koan. It goes, what did your face look like before you were born?
The answer is what face?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
What face are you talking about, Zen Master?
Right, right. And I don't know if that's the actual answer, but that's a very reasonable answer. What face? And it gets you to think, right? Well, if there's no face before you were born, then there's also no face after you die. You know,
Which means there's
um,
not much of a face now.
sure, sure.
All right. So, when we understand these imponderables that way, let's finish this off now with a way to answer a question.
Hmm.
Let us take an easy question, a yes no question. The answer is either yes or no. Did you turn the light on or not? Or basically, is the light on or not? Okay. There are six answers, six possible answers to every yes and no question.
Hmm.
Six answers, not two. Most people think that a yes or no question has only two answers, a yes or a no. But
Hmm.
then there is the more complicated one that comes out of Brahmanism, and that is, well, maybe it's both,
Hmm.
or maybe it's neither.
Hmm.
Okay? Maybe it's both, and maybe it's neither. Maybe it's a mixture of the two. And then, so that gives us four answers. The fifth answer, which is one that we are trained out of in Western culture, the one thing that will train us out of that more than anything else is a multiple choice test. Trains us out of that fifth answer so that we don't ever think about it. And what is that? The answer is I don't know. Is it
Hmm.
yes or is it no? It may be both, it may be neither, but the fifth answer is actually I don't know.
Hmm.
And then there's a sixth answer, which is the one that we're talking about now. And that is that not only I don't know, but I don't care, or that it's actually irrelevant.
Hmm.
So when people would ask about rebirth, eventually I'll have to get around to that that's an irrelevant question.
Hmm.
It's completely irrelevant, and that if I spend any time in thinking about it, I'm wasting my time. And not only that, but I might try to imagine something and then cling to that as an observation or as a viewpoint. And now I've got a concept.
So here's a question. Do you think it might just be fun to talk about?
Well, it
Y- you
is
know,
when we understand that it is irrelevant.
sure. So,
For most people, it's
like we
not.
Like
Most
we
people,
talked about movies, right? The other week. I think it was last week. That's fun to talk about. Why not just talk about rebirth in that sort of a sense, in a carefree, it
yeah,
might
it doesn't,
be, it might not be.
because it doesn't mean a thing, because it's irrelevant. And then it's easy and fun to talk about. But most people don't take it from there. You see, let's talk about how could it possibly be irrelevant. Well, we talked, I think you heard last time about if you are in New York and you go to San Francisco, you are not the same person in San Francisco as you were in New York. That you do not have to die and be reborn to be reborn. That you're reborn when you get off the couch and walk out the door. You're a different person now.
Sure.
If that's the case, then it's irrelevant about what happens after we're dead because I keep changing. I don't even know what next week is going to be like. I don't know who I'm going to be tomorrow. Why should I worry about
Yeah.
what I'm going to be like after I'm dead?
Sure.
All we
I
have
think
is this
it.
present moment. And so when we think about it from the concept of what we're doing this present moment, you're talking about, isn't it nice to talk about rebirth? Yeah, but we're doing that in this present moment. And when the conversation is over, so is the rebirth.
Sure. So, it's interesting you bring that up. So I had the thought today, I had kind of the insight today, and I've had it before, but it was a little stronger today than before. Which is that, I love to fantasize about things sometimes. I think many people do, most of us do, or at least many of us, about, maybe someday, I'll have a lot of money, or, I'll have this, I'll have that, that would be great.
Does
And
that bring
that
up
just,
agitation?
it does. Yeah, it
Okay?
totally does.
Be aware
And
of that.
yeah, yeah, and it's funny because I think rebirth is sort of the same kind of deal
For
where,
many people, it will bring up agitation when they start talking about it. It'll
right,
bring
right,
up
right,
agitation if they say it doesn't exist. How could it possibly exist? Then they get all agitated. And when they say,
right,
yeah, well, we've got to be reborn. If we don't get reborn, then why should we even bother to teach Sila? We've got to teach rebirth to these kids or they'll be misbehave their whole lives.
right,
That's Bhikkhu Bodhi's position.
and it's hard for people to give up things that they use to justify their behavior,
Hmm.
and so like for me, for example, like, I work a corporate consulting job, and I use that to justify. I use the potential future success to justify doing something that I don't really like that much. I mean, sometimes I like it, but sometimes I don't like it. It goes back and forth. But I use the potential reward, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, as justification for some misery. And so if I give that up,
Good action is going to give good results no matter what. That's the teaching that our whole society is based upon the law of karma.
right, right,
You
and if
do
I
good things, you'll get good results. You do bad things, you'll get bad results.
right, and if
But
I
it
just
doesn't
give
matter
up
how
the
much you
fantasy,
fantasize about getting rich, you might not get
yeah,
rich.
yeah, yeah, and if I give it up though, as a goal, it creates a crisis, and it's like, well, I'd rather not have the crisis, so I don't give up the goal.
Well, can you give up
But
the goal? Never mind giving it up. See, you're still now in a
yeah,
long term, like giving it up means never in the future instead of
right,
thinking about dropping it right now. Who worries about or why care about whether I care about things in the future or not? Right now, I don't have to care about anything.
right, right,
But at least right
and
now, I can be free from that anxiety.
right, and that's a happier way to look at it because if you take the point of view of giving it up, then that becomes its own trap.
It
You know,
becomes a
it's
should, it becomes a rule, it becomes you ought to give it up
right, and
instead of
it's
just
amazing how
give it up right now. Never mind about
how
the future. If you can give it up now, you can give it up in the future. You've already established that you can give it up.
right, and it's amazing to me how subtle these differences are, of giving something up right now versus giving it up completely, and say seizing on an unwholesome thought versus letting it just pass by, just noting it, it's kind of amazing to me how these subtle differences can have significant impact,
They
in
do.
practice. Yeah.
Because you take
Yeah.
one subtle trap and you feel beautiful, you feel fine. You take the other, which is the more established habit, and we feel agitated.
Right.
Noticing that, we can begin to change these very little subtle things, and it is actually time itself because we have been, let us say, put into the habit of thinking about that time exists.
Sure.
Time doesn't
Right.
exist. Only distance exists. Time doesn't exist. The past doesn't exist. It's gone. The future is never to be. Whatever you think about the future, it won't be the way that you think about it. It'll be whatever happens based upon cause and effect. But what we have is that cause and effect rolling on in this present moment as this present moment keeps rolling on. There is always just a now.
Sure.
But we don't train our kids that way. We train our kids that there is a future. You have to delay your gratification.
Right. Whole marshmallow test, all of that. You
So,
know, they should call it the misery test. It
well,
has the
the
wrong name.
parents do that with the kids. The kids are in the store. Oh, I want this, and mom doesn't have the money, and she'll say, "Oh, you have to wait. You can't have it now."
Well, what's funny is calling it the marshmallow test makes it very endearing. It's like, oh, like, because everyone likes marshmallows, so if you say, like, oh, you can wait for two marshmallows and that makes you a successful person, that's a great thing. You're familiar with the test, right? Marshmallow test? Yeah.
Uh, no, not exactly, but I assume what that means is that if the monkey takes one bean, he only gets that one bean. But if he'll leave that bean there, they'll put another one beside it.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. It's like very famous psychology, tests they did. And I guess what they found is those that would wait would have much better life outcomes, ultimately, and along a host of measures, following up with
Well,
these kids over decades. Yeah.
all right. So that means that in this case, the monkey is actually thinking. He recognizes something, and now he is in fact seizing his greed for that bean, saying that wait, wait,
Right.
and so this is the thing, though, that this monkey has figured out that the experiment is set up so that there will be another bean. What if the monkey has the idea, oh, if I just don't get that bean, that sometime, somewhere, some magical new bean will be added to it? And then the
Um,
bean doesn't get added. But he keeps
right.
waiting. He doesn't get his bean, the one bean, because he's hoping for two.
Sure. Which
And
is
that's
interesting
the part of the
because,
experiment that they haven't been able to do because how can they train the monkey to wait for one bean if they don't give him the second bean?
right, right.
Well, we train
And
our
that's much
humans that
more
way
like
with
life.
concepts. We can't train the monkey that way, but we train our kids that way. Oh, you can't have
Sure.
that bean. You got to wait, and then you can get two beans, and then two beans never happen.
Sure. And that's much more similar to what life is
That's life,
than
right? His
than
life
getting the
is
two
not an
beans.
experiment from with monkeys and psychologists.
Right, right. Yeah, it's done. The experiment's done with like 2-year-olds, 5-year-olds or something like that, 6-year-olds and humans, and they're given marshmallows, but same idea,
Hmm.
But um, it is interesting that you often don't get the bean, and in fact, if you do get the second bean, you might not even be able to enjoy it because of all the misery that you've incurred, along the way, or you might be old,
Or
and have
perhaps
just
small comfort.
yeah, yeah, and so you might get that second being, but you can't appreciate it, and you see that with a lot of rich people, is they
Oh,
just don't
absolutely.
appreciate.
Even
Yeah,
two beans is not enough because they've been taught that you got to have a dozen. Wait a minute, 2 dozen. Wait a minute, 500.
yeah. Th- There is a crazy story I heard a few years ago about the richest man in Europe, I believe. It was either Germany or Europe. I think it was in Europe. And he was worth $13 billion. And after the 2008 crisis hit, his 13 billion went down to 8 billion. And you know what he did?
Committed suicide.
Yeah, he jumped in front of a train.
Another Anna Karina movie. Looks like we have lost it.